Okay, so when we talk about graffiti art or outsider art, street art, I'm separating, distinguishing that from perhaps the artists we saw last week, who are artists who are working within the gallery system and the museum system at a global level, leaving Havana, coming back. And the artists we're going to look at are today are, I'd say, at least for now, working primarily on the street and of course on social media because they're posting their artwork to social media, and that's a big change in the world. And that certainly is something to take note of as part of this shifting world that we're living in. And of course, last week we talked about the death of Fidel, the death of Che Guevara, and I brought up the pandemic earlier just because that also left a big impact in Cuba, especially with tourism and the absence of tourism today, and the problems with the Ukraine war, raising oil prices. And hopefully you guys saw the video I sent you a link to, the Sky News Australia, about the protests. Now, I will say Sky News Australia, I'd say, is more on the center right. That's as a news source, some news sources are more center, more on the left, more on the right. I think it's very hard to find news about Cuba from the United States. I think possibly due to the fact that it's an election year, and the Florida is often a swing state when it comes to Cuba policy, not as much as it used to be. But even so, there's probably reasons why there's more of a news blackout about Cuba than other countries that take interest in Cuba. Some of it has to do with just its radioactivity of the subject matter. I think it has more to do perhaps here with the election year, but just keep in mind that news source is a little biased on the more right side. But still, in chance, it's important to kind of just be aware of the bias. That doesn't mean you shouldn't look at news that has a bias. And it's important to kind of understand whatever you look at with Cuba, there's going to be, you should assume there's more bias. And usually the two sides are very, polarized, with one side, often the left wing, being fully supportive of Cuba and kind of turning a blind eye to anything bad like human rights or anything. And the other extreme is totally anti-Castro, completely anti-revolution, and treats Cuba as like a prison cell with prisoners being the entire Cuban population. And there's truth to both of those sides. And of course, finding some kind of happy middle between the two of understanding is, important, but very hard in a polarized environment. So this is kind of the backdrop of Cuba. And I think that video, well, let me ask you guys, do you guys have any comments on the, and I'll go ahead into a picture so we aren't just looking at words. Any comments from the video that you saw, assuming some of you watched it? It was, of course, about the recent protests. Any thoughts about what's going on there, or, any comments in response to the video? Or maybe I say something.
I don't remember her name, but the lady that was talking, that she's from Cuba and has like family there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I found it really sad that she was basically like, I can't send any help or even money to my family because the regime will take their cut of it. So, it sucks that people that aren't there feel so cut off from their family and friends, and they can't even support them really without accidentally supporting something they don't agree with.
Right. And that's on top of the cut that like Western Union takes, right? I'm sure they must take 5, 10%, if not more. And people are sending remittances all over the world from the United States. And yeah, I think it's a real unfair thing, because you would expect, okay, Western Union can take its piece, but imagine someone sends you money here in the United States and the US government taxes it, or it's one thing that you tax a small amount, but to actually take a cut of everything, I would assume they would tax Western Union, right, not the individual sending the money. But that's really kind of feels almost mean-spirited. It's a gift. And yeah, it shows you that kind of microcosmic control. Of course, they would probably argue that, well, this is a necessary thing to do just to keep the country afloat. And they can always go back to that. Well, we're doing it for you. We're doing it to, for the benefit of the Cuban people, which, again, goes back to the first thing I was saying, that extremes of politics, everything tends to want to shift to the extreme, one side or the other. Anyone else have more comments about the video and the protests going on? There have been several, waves of protests start in June 2021. I think a lot of it seems to be course seems to correspond with the death of Fidel and the pandemic exacerbating things with food and gas shortages. Any other comments? The one lady with the curly hair was, I think, a little, she was pointing out that the USR like groomed Fidel. She was definitely in the very, that kind of where you can see the bias that, the news station will pick pundits or specialists, experts that kind of reveal their bias. And I think she was on the more kind of, the very extreme anti-Cuba, anti-Castro, which is completely legitimate. I think some of the things she was saying about Castro being groomed by the Soviet Union, yeah, perhaps he was a noted ally, potential ally, but I think Fidel, was someone who, is a Cuban who, fought against Batista, and it's just sort of an individual. I don't necessarily think he was a Manchurian candidate raised to become the leader of Cuba by some conspiracy by the Soviet Union. But, interesting, she mentioned documentation about that. So who knows what kind of stuff will come out one day when we finally get access to all the records about, the Cuban government, if we ever do. And I'm not sure if we ever deserve to or should. But that's definitely a video that shows you that there's quite a lot of protests. And let me ask you a question. You might have noticed the protests took place in the Sierra Maestra in the Santiago de Cuba. That's the far eastern region where we have our naval base in Guantanamo. Why do you think the protests were located there, or why do you think often the protests are located in Santiago in the far eastern part of the country?
I think it has to do probably with that since there's probably more US troops to take notice.
Yeah, that could be. And also, you're located really far away from the central, probably the center of government. So right, you would think like maybe protests against the government of the United States would take place far away from Washington, D.C., just because perhaps you might have less centralized authority there. And I think that's, I think it's an interesting parallel to the fact that Castro and Che Guevara and the other revolutionaries likewise started their protests, their violent, revolution in the Sierra Maestra Far East. So very likely it won't necessarily be Havana where you see any upheaval, but possibly as far away from the center of power. When I say the center of power, I mean like the military bases. And yeah, proximity to the United States Naval Base might give you kind of this sense of shelter, symbolic or otherwise. So that's might be where you want to keep your eye out. Now, one thing is we won't be looking at artists who are working in Santiago, but I think that is more where you're really going to have the boots on the ground kind of revolution or uprising or or protest or whatever may be the case. Whereas Havana is more the symbolic rehearsal for that. And I will say, I will stake my flag in the hill of saying that art absolutely breeds revolution and rehearses the revolution and anticipates revolution or inspires revolution. And it does so not necessarily in a kind of big way necessarily, but often it's very subtle ways, just kind of very thoughtful, intimate kind of moments of reflection where someone sees an artist perhaps making art and that inspires them to, oh, I can do that too, or they're giving me permission, they're liberating my sort of boundaries, and I'm willing to take to the streets now too. But think about the forces stopping people from taking to the streets. And here you get to the kind of sinister side of, well, imagine you're the government and you don't want people taking to the streets. Well, the first thing I was thinking is if you don't have food, it's very hard to kind of prepare for, to protest because the government can just say, nope, no more food, no more water. And you're really kind of, uh, out of luck there. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's an element of, well, let's just not give people enough food because if we do give them enough food, they might revolt. Because I think that's one of the key things you need if you want to plan some kind of protest with people. First, you want to make sure you have a probably inner circle of people who are on the same page, and then they send out the call to everyone else. And you have to make sure you have enough food saved up in case you lose your job or you need to go away from work. And you can imagine how the availability of food is a real important source of control. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Wow. So turning off the internet when these protests happen, wow, that's just so gross. So yeah, that control, that's a really, that really is evidence so showing that it's more that you can't just blame the embargo, because as you saw, the government often blames like Americans for inciting these protests. if even indirectly saying things like, the U.S. embargo is causing the food shortages, which then causes protests. But also seems in the video they were suggesting more directly, like the United States government is directly inciting these protests. And historically there was some truth to that, especially in the 1990s, the Brothers to the Rescue. But I think right now, I think if there's any interest in doing that, it's not like it used to be, even up to 10 years ago. And I wouldn't even be surprised if it's not at all, just because there isn't really much reason to get to risk anything politically on Cuba right now by the Biden administration. So, there's not really many points to be scored with doing anything like that, especially during an election year. So I think it's probably an authentic groundswell of people who are taking to the streets because they don't have enough food and they don't have enough electricity in it. And you pass a point where the fear of going to jail is less than the uncertainty of and outrage of not having enough food. But again, that shortage of food might also be an element of control. So that's something to consider. And as we look at the artwork today, I think you really have to keep those protests in the back of your mind, as kind of a parallel to the protests that we're going to see in the world of art, or at least in the outside of the world of art. And just a reminder, we throughout the semester, I've kind of, at least after the revolution, I pointed out that all these artists are trained by the revolution. It's very hard to separate the revolution from the art schools, from there seems to be no boundary between the revolution and your own personal world, your personal life. And then comes along these artists today who are like Banksy, in in the sense that, and hopefully you guys all know Banksy. We'll be looking at a little bit of his work today. Assuming it's a he, I don't even know. I think his identity remains somewhat anonymous, and that is really key to understanding his role as an artist. I think the art world, probably up until the last few decades, swung so far to the left or the right, or swung so far into kind of the like celebrity institution, the art galleries, that Banksy is kind of single-handedly pushing that pendulum back the other direction, trying to um, uh, give an institutional critique, a critique of the art world. What kinds of, like when we talk about Banksy criticizing the art world, what kinds of things do you think he's criticizing? Like, what is it, the nature of his institutional critique? Or what could be, even if you don't know Banksy, like what kind of things would a street artist be criticizing about the art world just by not contributing to the art world? Well, one thing you might think about is the world of art has its commercialized. I think Banksy for sure is kind of somewhat resisting the idea of commercialization, maybe even just resisting the idea of the art world being, let's see what someone says, yeah, art, the commodity. I think that's a key part of it, that once you put art in a gallery, in a museum, you're kind of commodifying it. And so I think the street artists, there's a long tradition in the United States of, with Basquiat, Samo, um, Keith Haring, who we'll look at today, a tradition of reclaiming public space. That's one part of it, perhaps. Rejecting the idea of art as a commodity, um, and maybe criticizing the institutions because they're like gatekeepers who preserve the status quo. So, by definition, Banksy is someone who would be outside of the establishment. So, when we look at the equivalent of Banksy of Cuba, the question I think is likewise, is he working within the revolution or outside the revolution? And I don't think you can do anything but agree that he's an artist working in Cuba on the streets, unless they're getting paid for by the government, their art supplies and given space to paint on. I think we can agree that they're working outside the revolution. And then the question becomes, well, what forces allow them to work with more liberty than before? And I think one of those is the deterioration of the city. But also, I think there is some kind of shift going on in this age after Fidel, this age after, the Castro brothers, and the age after the Cold War. So that's something to think about. So even a picture like this, when I was in Guatemala in the Peace Corps, and many places in the world, you'll see street dogs. And that's something probably not so common in the United States, same with some exceptions, but it's something very common in places, especially places with a lot of poverty. We tend to think of dogs as pets that live, inside the house, sleep on our beds. I've never owned a dog, but I hear all about that. I've seen it on TV. So, when I was in Guatemala, the dog did not sleep on the bed with people's homes. It was more of like a security, like so that no one stole your TV. So, and you didn't pet your dog. You didn't give the dog the good food scraps. It was really like a service animal, and really often emaciated. And, there are some exceptions. If you live in the capital of Guatemala, people are wealthier and they treat dogs as more of a pet. But one of the things you might notice when you go to a country with more poverty is, you're gonna be aghast at how dogs are so different and so differently treated. And so a street dog is kind of like a mirror image of poverty, or the other side, underbelly of poverty. And, it's interesting when we think about animals and dogs, we tend to feel a lot more sympathy for dogs than people, or, for pets than people sometimes, because there's a sense that they don't know, they're not humans, they don't have that sense of right or wrong, and so they're innocent. That's why all dogs go to heaven. And so it's a very powerful thing. Like, same with children, like thinking about children. Children aren't legally susceptible or legally bound to the same laws that adults are. You guys are almost 21, some of you, so even some of you can get away with things. I don't know, maybe you're 18 now, so maybe not, but I guess all that's left is voting and drinking. But as you know, like, your rights really become real when you're an adult. So there's something and you'll see today that some of these artists use children and animals as almost like a metaphor for addressing adult problems. So already, just on that alone, it's a very clever use of metaphor to address things without being too on the nose, too precise. And that's a very clever way of sort of skirting trouble, being too critical directly, kind of indirect criticism, but at a ground level, at the street level. And so that's something we're going to see today. Like, how do you navigate this question of holding up a mirror to the poverty and the decay going on in your country? Well, here's one solution. So we're going to be looking at this artist's work today, primarily, in addition to a few others. This is work by Julia Rodriguez, and we'll get more into his work in depth. So what do you see here? We got a dog, and I assume we see the skeleton, and that implies it's sort of famished. So I think the idea of seeing the bones is not an X-ray so much as a visualization of emaciation, being skinny to the bones, and the dog looks like it's kind of looking into an empty bowl. And it's a very minimalist painting, and I think that's really a wonderful thing. It's, you think about the constraints of graffiti. One, it has to be quick because you might get arrested. In New York City, there's a lot of graffiti that comes out every summer, and it's very much part of youth culture and seasonal, and you want to make it quick. And one thing you might consider is, let me ask you, is this artist using stencil, or is this hand painted? And I guess stencil isn't necessarily not hand painted, but is this painted with a brush, or how do you think the artist applied the paint to this work of art here? And someone says, yeah, it looks hand painted to me. So let's kind of all agree on that. And that's something to think about. I would not be surprised if spray paint and even maybe pieces of paper to cut out into stencil are less available in Cuba. Yeah, too big for a stencil. That's a great point. I hadn't realized that stencils can't be too large. So yeah, in a way, his subject matter is too big for a stencil. And it's something to think about. Is stenciling as available to people impoverished? It's not just poverty, it's lack of access to art materials. And when I talk about poverty, I don't mean like impoverished soul. I mean like economic poverty, of course. And so I think we can understand this dog as like a mirror reflection of the hunger and uncertainty, perhaps, of the Cuban people, and a very clever metaphor for people. So today we're going to kind of consider this question of maybe what does it mean to be outsider art, street artist, of course. Maybe perhaps thinking about what we've learned about with some muralism and graffiti. But I think the idea is looking at street art in Cuba, is it different? And that noise in the back will be over in a moment. Is it different looking at street art in Cuba versus other countries? And I think, that question is very interesting. Even looking at this painting to on the right, which we'll get back to, you notice the word revolution. This is from Cuba. The word revolution is in English. I think that's notable. But also you got a revolution, in a way, it's like there's nothing wrong. All you're doing is saying revolution. That's, Cuban revolution, but it might be cleverly playing with that idea because, in Cuba, can you talk about revolution and could it possibly be considered anti-revolutionary because your revolution is against the revolution kind of thing? So that's the kind of nature of the complexity here, where something like this to us would just be like, okay, a revolution against the system. But in Cuba, it rings differently. So that's just something to keep in mind, that you can't use the same kind of Banksy standard. It's not a direct kind of copy. You have to consider the context in Cuba, where revolution is kind of, that's the status quo is the revolution. And when I look at this painting, this almost looks like something you might see in the United States. The style is reminiscent of maybe some of the cartoons or animation you see, and I think it shows some of the globalization of painting, of art. So these are some questions we considered last time, and I just wanted to point out, no Basquiat, no Banksy in Cuba. Well, that's kind of what we're going to look at today. Is that are the artists we see the equivalent of a Banksy or a Basquiat, either in terms of the institutional critique of the art world, but also in terms of this idea of critiquing the revolution and the status quo. So here is Keith Haring painting his artwork in the subway tunnels. What street is this? It looks like 17th Street, probably around the West Village or somewhere. And so he basically is what the model, or if not, Basquiat too, a model for an artist working on the streets, filling the void, filling empty spaces with meaning and commenting on the status quo. And I think this is certainly kind of the equivalent of a Banksy, someone who in the 1980s was working outside the art world. Now, Keith Haring went on to be very famous for advocating for AIDS victims. I think one of the first, or someone who was a gay artist, and not at all ashamed about that or ashamed of celebrating that. And I think this era in the 1980s is the best, perhaps, analogy to what's going on in Cuba right now, with these artists filling spaces that are in decay, in decline. And New York was very much in the decline in the 1980s. People say Giuliani cleaned it all up, and he also, caused other problems. But that certainly was different in the New York was very different in the 1980s, with graffiti all over the place on the subway cars. Perhaps it's getting back to that now. And the point I'm just trying to show is that there's a kind of inverse relation between deterioration and artists filling the void, artists transforming that deterioration into something meaningful or just less ugly. So Basquiat is another great example of a street artist. And just, you look at the paint on his jacket here, you can really see that he's, not trying to be, tidy or clean. He's really proclaiming his total adherence to the idea of being a street artist. And that's one of the wonderful things about Basquiat. He's someone who doesn't come from the art world, and he feels like a more authentic voice. And of course, that's loaded with contradiction, especially if you become a famous artist and a darling of the art world. But that's different than the artists who we're going to look at today, who have not become darlings of the art world in Cuba at all. And I think they could become that. But what's so interesting is what we're going to look at today is really history that's unwritten. And one day you're going to look back at this and probably say, wow, that we were looking at this artist's work, and here they are now, or this is what's happened to them since. And I think that will be really neat. So remember, we're in a time of uncertainty after the Cold War, after the death of Fidel, after the death of Che Guevara. And these are many layers of uncertainty: political uncertainty, economic uncertainty, social uncertainty, even uncertainty about the soul of your nation. And the spirit of your nation, and the spirit of the revolution, of course. So, Venezuela no longer providing oil to Cuba, and we don't have oil. It's hard to grow food, hard to create fertilizers, hard to transport your workers to work, hard to go to work, hard to go to school, and no lights, rolling blackouts. And yeah, just imagine rolling blackouts, especially if it's really hot out, or, if you just need power to keep your baby, in a comfortable temperature, or all kinds of problems. because of the rolling blackouts. And yet the sort of hatred or the anger towards the United States continues as a sort of, and as the source of the problems. Here you can see Señores Imperialistas, Señor, Sir, and Mr. Imperialists. No les tenemos absolutamente ningún miedo. We are not afraid of you at all. This poster has been in Cuba forever. And you can see they're yelling at the United States. And this is something you see all over Cuba, even today. I don't think they're freshly painted. And we talked last week about how these are kind of relics from a different time, but they're also examples of paintings on the street. And so in a way, you kind of can see how at the ground level, politics is at the ground level. These outdoor artists, and these aren't outdoor art or outsider artists so much as paintings done by the government to support the revolution at the ground level. But these are all falling apart. And, I don't think there's much will to repaint them, and certainly not much will to paint these from scratch, right? So we'll see how these relate to the street artists today, but certainly in a way, these street artists are substituting the locations or filling in the same locations where stuff like this used to be. So we'll see these street artists kind of being replacements for this earlier era of propaganda. So yeah, remember that as we move forward. So revolution, yeah, this is, for me, this could be in the United States, but knowing that it's in Cuba really kind of shifts the way you kind of appreciate this. And I really think it's interesting that the word revolution is in English as opposed to Spanish. Now, I will say that this isn't necessarily very recognizably Cuban. It could be, I could see as Cuba. And I wonder if this seemed to be a little more aggressive, just having people on the rooftops. This seems to be protest. And yet to say revolution, you don't really know if they're talking about the Cuban Revolution or revolution against Cuba. So that, again, that's a very clever kind of use of revolution here. And the context really helps you understand that. So this is the first artist whose name we're kind of going to know. And if you go to Cuba today, you'll see this kind of smiling face all over the place. And I think you have to understand that tourism, and street art go hand in hand in the sense that people want to do street tours around the city, and showing people street art will be, a way to enhance the tourist experience. You can even see some hints of Ana Mendieta here. I don't know if you remember, some of her shapes had that almost leaf-like quality. So there's certainly the ghost of Ana Mendieta is thriving, I think, still in Cuba. And that face, the smiling face, you have to look at this, when you look at the street art, you kind of have to think about, well, the simplicity, the minimalism of having a face that's so like self-assured, that smiling face with the nose ring seems very kind of pleased, and doesn't seem anything kind of there's nothing overtly offensive or counter-revolutionary about it. And so one thing you could think about with street art is it's what's the language of street art, or what's the operating system of street art? Does it work with metaphors? Does it work kind of outside the revolution? And we'll see this. I think you can engage that question more clearly with the other artists we see. This is more of like official art, probably meant to enhance a very visible part, the malecon, so that tourists don't just see empty, falling apart walls. So alongside the art we're going to see today, there's also in Cuba places where the government is, certainly tidying up and making it prettier as a way to kind of mask the dilapidation. So here is a great, one of the first we'll see it. In fact, this wall shows a few of the artists we'll look at. The one on the left says 2 + 2 = 5. And if I recall, I think that's a reference back to 1984, the book by George Orwell about a totalitarian future where everyone's on drugs and the government basically convinces you that 2 + 2 = 5. And so I wouldn't be surprised if he's referencing George Orwell. And also it's a very powerful critique against totalitarianism, the idea that truth is subjective. And we'll see his artwork in a moment. I think he's the one in the middle here. I'm not sure, but the one we're going to mainly focus on is Julia Rodriguez there on the right. And we'll get to him in just a moment. So these are very, these are some examples of street art. Obviously I think you can agree this isn't, they're not provided art materials by the government. So these are artists who are totally working on their own, deciding where to make art. And One thing you might think about is comparing art in New York City or art that you see in the United States, um, that you might see on the side of a highway, or on the crosstown, or near railroad tracks, or not graffiti that's like a special that's commissioned by the store or the business, but graffiti that's filling a void. And when I think about graffiti in the United States, it's often, not always, but often made by younger people who are doing it as an act of defiance, often at night, often with very kind of either nihilistic or kind of anti-establishment messages. And I don't think that's, and I've thought about this, and I could be wrong, but when I look at these artists from Cuba, there is perhaps some of that, but I feel like these art, the examples like this aren't necessarily coming from that same place of angst and nihilism, so much as just kind of wanting to hold up a mirror to for everyday Cubans to look at. And there's something very positive ultimately about these murals that we're going to see, in a way that you don't necessarily feel that same positivity coming from all graffiti in the United States. Sometimes it's very kind of just, about tagging, about territory, marking your territory, or just making something very flashy and bright, but you're not necessarily, it's more like an inside joke, or something where only if you know the code language, you kind of understand what the message is. Whereas stuff here, it feels very different than the graffiti I'm used to seeing in the United States, or at least art that fills the void. And so that's something that's very interesting for me, that I want to keep kind of understanding, because there could be, a sense of maybe a more communitarian use of art, just because of the fact that the revolution is so, such a deep part of the culture. And also just perhaps the artists are using the idea of filling the void, that empty space, as just a way of providing hope, and again, holding up a mirror, so that people maybe feel a little bit more empathy, and or a sense of hope, and like connection to other people who are likewise suffering, and feel a lot of uncertainty. And I mean, look at the wall that is painted on. I think one of the reasons why, as an artist, you can paint on a wall without getting into trouble is if the wall is falling apart, and anything you do to it will look better. So there's that element of, the more decay there is, the more kind of permission you're going to have, I think, to transform the space. What do you think is actually the message here? Is there a message to this picture? Something to consider, right? You might consider, well, is the artist trying to, pick a message? Are they more working intuitively? Are they, can you get a sense that they're working to skirt censorship? And these are things to consider as we look at the art today. Like, what are the concerns, and maybe the guiding principles of this artwork? Yeah, so here 2 + 2 = 5. But this looks like a tourist is taking some people to go see the artwork. And I love the idea that, street art is part of the a tour guide's kind of itinerary. And one thing you might think about, is there anything recognizably Cuban about this figure? Clearly this is an avatar that the artist has created. And what would you say about this avatar? Like, what choices has the artist made when comes into this avatar that they've created? Here's a few more. So what are some of the characteristics of this what icon of the streets of Cuba? It's
Kind
not
of
just
being an like anonymous, can't see their whole face. And I guess that also lends to, I mean, we saw the one where they were pregnant. Maybe it's like genderless, or it could be anybody at all. It's kind of like a one slur thing, where this could be anybody. This could be you or your family or whatever.
great. Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's cool. I love that I like that idea, the interpretation that, because the mask, I assume you can mean because of the mask, it conceals the identity, and therefore, yes, it could be you, it could be anyone. That's really, really wonderful. And that almost, that achieves two things simultaneously. One, it achieves that, gives you kind of a connection. This could be anyone, but also it kind of conceals, and it seems to reflect the idea that they're trying to remain anonymous, like Banksy, almost as if like Zorro, or someone who's kind of working outside the system, and that anonymity is safety. And that's very interesting. And I think we would agree that Banksy is anonymous for different reasons than this artist trying to kind of offer this veil of anonymity. And I think most Cubans would that would resonate with them because they would understand, okay, as an artist working in the street, you have to be careful, and that anonymity is safety in a world of supervision and kind of big brother watching. Oh, great. That's another wonderful observation. That subtle observation that he's defeated and tired. That's easy to overlook, the sort of emotion under that face, but there is emotion. That's really important to understand. The defeated, tired eyes, the mouth isn't open. It's sort of almost frowning. And it's sort of this figure who's like dressed up like a bank robber, but he's doing mundane things like changing the channel. You notice it says paz, which is peace. I'm not sure if that's, what the comment there is, but certainly 2 + 2 = 5 is sort of the uh, text that goes along with this character here, who, yeah, I think is meant to be an anonymous Cuban, and yeah, meant to be, it could be anyone, and therefore is sort of a superhero, almost like a vigilante superhero in the streets, kind of holding up a mirror to the concerns that everyone's feeling. Maybe the question mark, question mark is very powerful given the context, uncertainty, and yet it is still like a metaphorical language. And yeah, the pregnant woman, that's so powerful. It almost looks like an egg yolk in the thought bubble. I don't know if it's meant to be an egg yolk, but yeah, if you think about if it is an egg yolk, and I could be wrong, but it feels like that's a reference back to pregnancy, and not a very positive reference either. The sort of the final end of an egg is to be turned into an egg yolk. And when you're talking about a person pregnant, it's almost like they're thinking about eating the egg, like thinking about food while they have a baby in their belly, is a really horrible and a real indictment of a government when someone's hungry and yet they have a baby that they're raising. And the location here is so powerful, hidden away underneath the archway. And, even this, I think, I'm sure there are wonderful examples of, graffiti art of some similar to perhaps this, but because Cuba is such a, contained, I would think most artists in New York, they would be addressing the concerns of their barrio, their local, street, of their neighborhood, maybe New York City, and maybe the United States as a whole. But certainly, that's a bigger fish to fry than in Cuba, where you have much more smaller kind of culture, at least, population, and much more self-contained. So I feel like this artwork kind of speaks to the chorus a lot louder and more clearly, and everyone is kind of on the same page. Whereas in New York, graffiti is kind of speaking to a small circle of people, and it's not really meant for everyone's appreciation so much as I think a certain segment of youth society, or maybe the neighborhood. But you can almost feel like this is much more than just someone, trying to territorialize public space, so much as, like, again, yeah, hold up a mirror to the concerns going on. And really kind of goes to the real valuable heart of art, which is to kind of externalize that internal world, to put on the outside what is going on on the inside, and do so in a way that kind of affirms other people and doesn't get you thrown in jail. And so there's a lot, just, I think the most perhaps potentially dangerous thing here is 2 + 2 = 5. You kind of have to read 1984 to fully appreciate that. But the idea is just, if the government says 2 + 2 = 5, you better say 2 + 2 = 5. And there's a certain irony of subverting that and kind of reclaiming this idea of truth is subjective, or at least saying, in a world where truth is subjective, you have no power. Because even that, your own two eyes, you can't believe what you see with your own two eyes. But this is some really, just the idea of a pregnant person and, wondering about the future. They're very, very powerful stuff. And like you said, Laura, the sort of figure is very sad and like kind of dejected. Um, I didn't ask this. I think this is a quote from another person interviewing Fabian. Um, and this is the quote saying, "People say that 2 + 2 = 4, but I don't see it like that. I believe it can equal whatever you want it to be." So very interesting. That's a totally different take than what I said about kind of the totalitarian elements of 1984. In a way, I think he's taking that idea of 2 + 2 = 5, and he's saying, no, I am control of the truth. I'm going to make decisions for myself about what the truth is. And so you can kind of see that from a totally different perspective, that he's saying, no, my subjectivity is truth. and it's not the government who's the final word, but my own personal. So that goes back to the idea of expression and personal expression, and kind of removes you from the revolution. When you say, no, I don't see like I believe it can equal whatever you want it to be. I think what he's saying there is, it's not the government who tells me what to believe. I tell myself what to believe. And if that is the case, then you can really see how this is such a powerful message for, that woman there and that kid there to say, your beliefs matter, not just what, Fidel tells you what to believe. And yeah, it shifts a little bit when he's lying down, versus standing up. The idea of like a gadfly, someone who's challenging the status quo, lying down is, it kind of reminds me of China. In China right now, there's a lying flat movement, young people who don't feel any sense of future, investments and property and all that. They are spending all day like lying down, the equivalent of lying flat, like playing video games and not getting invested in the world because there's not so much hope. At least that's what I've heard. And I think that's probably to a degree going on in the United States too, with people kind of checking out of the workplace and not feeling too much of a sense of being a stakeholder in society, especially when a lot of money is hoarded by certain generations, or inflation and all those other things. So this artwork is, I think, when you go to Cuba, and I hope you all do one day, you'll see this all over the place in Havana. And I think it's a big part of revitalizing Havana as it falls apart, crumbles. You can see how old some of these buildings are, people drying their clothes, on the streets. And this young generation growing up, not really knowing much about the revolution except through these pictures all around them. And, kind of reminds me of this woman lying down. It's hard not to think about the legacy of, someone lying in the grass outside the revolution, or just wondering about the future. So, just someone lying down in Cuba, there's this, it's more than meets the eye. But this is, I think, I'm not sure if this is by 2 + 2 = 5 by Fabian, but you can see, here's, I think, probably a reference, perhaps to the ocean or to food. I will say there's something interesting about the mask. When you think of it, another interpretation of the mask is, there's two places your eyes can see and your mouth can smell, and your nose your mouth can taste and speak, and your nose can smell, but there's no holes for the ears. So maybe there also is a kind of a metaphor about, or a symbolic comment about, your senses depriving, or you can't hear, but you can trust your eyes, you can use your voice, you can smell. So there could be another layer there of kind of cutting off certain senses. But certainly a dead fish, pointing at a dead fish. I don't know. What do you think? What could be like? Is that hunger? Is he talking about food here? Or is the dead fish maybe a reference to Cubans crossing the water? Maybe I kind of covered those bases there. It seems like those are possibilities, right? Could be both, but there's nothing really super critical about the government so much as just maybe commenting on, there's not enough to eat. And I think it would be a really bad idea if the government, said, "Oh, how dare you paint pictures of, people expressing concern for being hungry." I mean, that would be even worse than not giving people food. So, perhaps that Cuba's reached a level where, if you're talking about hunger, there's no one who's going to ever, shut you up because, you've reached that lowest point where there's nothing else to lose anymore. Which is, again, it's a very tragic reality. Oh, okay. Oh, interesting. That's great. Yeah, that's great, Raymond. No, I think that's really powerful. And I think that the power of these pictures is that they're so minimal because they're kind of outsider art, and those choices therefore become bigger than meets the eye. And so just the fact that he's pointing out the fish, I didn't think about that. That's brilliant. Like, hey, can I eat this? Like asking for permission to eat it is, yeah, that's really powerful. So yeah, keep that level of calibration going on as we look at more of the artists today. So now we're going to look at Julia, I'm thinking I call him Julia Rodriguez, but Julia Perez. And he's someone who I'd like to interview one day, but something to consider is, these materials. He says hard to get, the kind of materials for art. And, one thing you might think about, spray paint is probably harder to get a hold of than, tubes of paint or maybe cans of paint, and maybe certain colors are more available. I would imagine in Cuba, it's much easier to find red, white, and blue because that is the color for the flag and street signs. So perhaps that's why we see that color frequently. But these are some works by Julia Perez, and I think you can see there's a common theme that emerges with food and hunger. And these figures that are kind of like throwbacks to Amelia, not Amelia Pelayo, but Antonia Itis, these kind of gruesome or ghoulish kind of figures, which, you can't help but kind of wonder, are these meant to be Cubans who are kind of transforming into these metaphorically grotesque bodies that are, what are they? They're very expressive. And so what is the metaphor for this expression? And, notice the location here, a very interesting location, almost like a stage setting for this work of art. And, using minimal colors, but with a sense of depth and maybe a light source. You notice he signs his name there, so he's not afraid of claiming his work. And so that's pretty bold, and perhaps also a sign that he doesn't think he's doing anything either that could get him in big trouble, or that he doesn't care, and or something else. But let's take a look at a few more artists, works of art by him, so you can kind of see this kind of this style and his subject matter, and find anything kind of that you might find meaningful. So here is almost a reference to a dog that's overbred, someone with a flower, but looking really kind of genuflecting, lowering themselves. But they look really beaten down. And I'd say they're really kind of unflattering, grotesque colors. The kind of critique that got Antonia Itis in trouble for her artwork. It reminds me of the pictures we saw last week of the sort of the, the deterioration, the decay. And this is the kind of decay you see all over Cuba. And I think this art palette kind of reflects that decay. And like I said earlier, these pictures substitute for locations where before you might have seen Che Guevara or Fidel Castro. Now you just see, you see decaying walls, decaying subject matter. And yeah, it's really, you see the scale, really big painting. And, something not overtly political. There's nothing clearly political. It's not Che Guevara. It's not Fidel. It's not even recognizably a person so much as like a grotesque, like Charybdis, or like a griffin, some kind of Greek mythological combination of human and animal. And I think that kind of goes a long way in explaining, what he's trying to do, maybe kind of to make it not, the same way that other artists, 2 + 2 = 5 is covers his face, and so it could be any Cuban. I think likewise here, they must be Cubans. I don't think there's any way to think except that these are either Cubans or this is the artist himself. And so this is really a mirror image of what Cubans are going through, him going through this, other Cubans going through this, and putting it in public as a way to say, look, we're all going through this together. I think, this is much more politically incendiary, perhaps, than other things we saw, although, of course, that depends because, asking if you can eat something could be seen as incendiary. But, the flag sticking straight through your body, the fallen kind of figure looking up at the flag, no arms, or at least the arms, you can't really tell if they have arms. Kind of reminds me of Carlos Martial. We saw his work last week. And perhaps even more kind of, I think Carlos Martial isn't necessarily biting the hand that feeds him so much. There's no Cuban flag stuck into him there. Maybe in some cases there are, but I think his is more of an institutional critique going into the institutions, right? Which is, you could say, even more powerful. But I think Julia Perez is kind of working outside the institution with, obviously a very similar kind of subject matter here, the body being, bleeding from, I guess the idea of the flag, serving your flag and sacrificing. But this is hardly that sort of Jose Marti sacrifice. This is much more like the flag is kind of murdering you. And I can't help but think, am I wrong that there's a similarity between these Antonia Itis pictures we saw in 1966, very unflattering pictures of neighbors, or at least, just pictures that are very expressive. And, this got her into trouble because, artists or critics or bureaucrats said that she was too, a defeatist. She had a defeatist attitude, and maybe it was too nihilistic, perhaps. But I think she might have just been holding up a mirror to how she saw Cubans or Cuban society. And I think that's kind of what Julia Perez is doing here. But very different to paintings on an easel versus putting them out in public. And I really don't think you would have ever seen this back in the 1980s, 1990s, because there's nothing to, there's no celebration of the Cuban Revolution here. If anything, it seems like a reflection of the despair and wanting food. What do you guys think about, is there a criticism of the government or of like, are these figures morphing into these kind of I don't know, like Hieronymus Bosch like shapes that are, you know, kind of devoid of individuality? There's no hair, there's no clear gender, they have no clothing on, so they're kind of reduced to their nudity, and they're kind of morphing into other shapes and missing limbs. What do you think this is he saying anything about Cuba or Cuban society? Is he going to end up when the government figures it out, are they going to throw him in jail because someone deciphers it and tells them, oh, this is what he's really doing? Now, I don't think the government has enough time to care about these kind of matters anymore because it's too busy struggling to just probably get the basic things provided for. So that goes a little ways in explaining perhaps why Julia Perez is able to take more liberties perhaps with public space today. But Eddie, do you guys have any thoughts about what he might be doing? These are very powerful pictures. Again, something you wouldn't have seen, I don't think, in the 1990s because it's just too perhaps non-Cuban, too ground level, too expressionistic, too despairing, too uncertain. I mean, it's one thing to have these on a canvas, right? And a very different thing to put them in public for everyone to see. It's almost, especially in a place where within the revolution, everything, that means every wall, every public surface is revolutionary. So in a way, you're kind of co-opting the revolution space, its own entitled space, and using it for your own self-expression. Pointing upwards, that's a very long history in art of people pointing upwards to heaven and or to what's the future, but something to consider, if you want to write about this artist and these use of these shapes, these figures, where they're located is very important. A very small figure on the side of the road here, you're revitalizing the void, you're revitalizing deterioration, but you're also commenting on day-to-day life and doing so in a way that's part of everyday life, and it's not just in the gallery, not in the museum, and certainly not something for tourists, to see abroad. I mean, for foreigners to see in their own country, but rather, I don't think you would cut this off of the wall and, export it and sell it. So these pictures are by definition kind of non-commercial, which I think is also awesome because this artist isn't really kind of trying to, Banksy, now his artwork is sold at Sotheby's, and what he does is he shreds it at the point of sale to kind of maintain his authenticity. But at the same time, he probably didn't shred the entire painting because otherwise he would have gotten in trouble with the contract with Sotheby's. So, Banksy's kind of authenticity stops once he starts, or could end once he starts selling at Sotheby's and becoming a millionaire artist. I think his anonymity is a key part of preserving that authenticity. So, even subtle things like the way this figure's looking out. I think Lara was pointing out the last example, the despondent, despairing 2 + 2 = 5. Well, what expression is this to you? When you see this expression, how would you describe it? The facial expression, of course. And
I was gonna say like death stare.
what is it?
I was gonna say like death stare.
Yeah, despair.
Like despair, or death stare. Just
Yeah, there's something like
just stare into your
with your
soul.
your chin up, like looking down, like you're like looking at your bout, like you're looking at your death, like half flashing before your eyes, kind of thing. Like something really powerful is happening. Yeah, scared. Yeah, there's like an element of scare, shock, fear, shock. And again, it goes back to a theme that's hard to really express, but I've tried this idea of expression. The realm of personal expression is almost by definition so like removed from politics, at least in the sense that it's not coming from anyone on the outside. Your own self-expression comes from the inside. It's your emotion. And there's something really powerful about, that emotional quality that we each have that is so individualized and so humanized and personalized that it almost just this face expressing fear is kind of a very powerful criticism. And yet the part of the power is it's such an individualized thing that it's not like you're filtering this expression through the revolution. It's just someone reacting to something they're seeing, which you can never control that. There's, how can you control this? What are you going to say? How dare someone react to stuff they're seeing. And yet I think that's such a powerful choice by the artist, so clever to pick something like this, to do something like this, because it is such it kind of transcends the status quo. Yeah, disgust, I think too. And you can really see how that is such a powerful visual statement about the context, and yet it's powerful also because it's not so easy to criticize as being, against the revolution. All it is someone looking at it with disgust. And as soon as you do criticize it for being anti-revolutionary, in a way, you're just proving the picture right. You're proving the artist right. So it's a very delicate act. Probably that's why the government's not so involved with censorship. One, it's anymore, or at least in this case, one, they probably see this as only enhancing Havana streets, but two, you know, it's probably just too big of a can of worms to get into when there's so many other fish to fry right now in Cuba. So we saw this earlier. I think you could see a little more of the context here. This probably trash thrown on the ground. Um, the red in the background, very minimalist. A lot. I think still a lot of room still for interpretation of these figures. Here are the artist next to his work, um, and you can see how quickly things decay when they're in public. Just this is probably painted October 16th, 2017. So in just a matter of a few years, you can see how quickly artwork that's out exposed to the elements fades or deteriorates. So even the artwork that's meant to make more beautiful the street also will fade into kind of ugliness without the right kind of repair and maintenance. So I'm going to show you some of his work more in terms of as a function of time. So we were on June 11th, 2020. There were some protests in 2021 in June. So certainly, you can almost see him kind of foreshadowing protests and playing around with these figures that he's using so wonderfully. The star, the knife. There's some of these have very clear references to Cuba. Here, this is a year after that protest in June. And, this is pretty, I think, one of the most clear examples of protest and, taking to the streets or blowing things up. And, he's probably painting that on a piece of rubble. November 11th, 2023. November 25th, 2023. Food. I think, again, that's a big theme in his work, food. It looks like he's reinventing the Cuban flag, perhaps here. All painted on rubble. February 3rd, now we're getting to 2 months ago. Now these, I think, are painted on canvas, and some of them aren't. Now here's an exception. This is, I'm not sure, I'd have to ask him more about this. And it's neat to see him kind of venture into more, what would you call this, more kind of traditional painting, even though it's abstract, certainly not street art. But I think a powerful comment on the ocean, or that perhaps even the Straits of Florida, that one little drippy line, like this insignificant speck on the ocean. Certainly not impossible to consider this as a comment on the ocean and the kind of various interpretations of the ocean as a source of danger that we've seen. And I think even here, almost feels like a reflection or similar kind of approach to addressing water, and the idea of water in Cuba is very different for us. And, I think he powerfully tackles that here. Um, March 16th, 2024. Now we're in this month. So these were painted, or sorry, last month. These were painted a few weeks ago. It looks like you got a cell phone, smartphone. We got ombre, and it looks like he's fighting up against someone with some kind of helmet, the flag, and of course the symbol of communism. So much more clearly political. And I think probably this is not painted on the wall. This might be the kind of thing where if you painted it on the wall, you might get in trouble. So that's something to think about. But I'm guessing he's gonna take that risk and start risking that more, because you do see things like this. This is from a few weeks ago, March 19th, 2024. It almost feels like a Belkis Ayon. Some certainly feels like some of the artists we've seen, as well as looking like his own work. And it looks like this figure in the white is like comforting the Cuban here, like some sort of ghost or a spirit of hope comforting the Cuban. Here it says, "Welcome to Cuba," and you have like a martini glass and a skeleton. This is obviously for the tourists, or him commenting about Cuba to the tourists, and pretty clear commentary. March 19th, Cuban official dangling food. in front of someone's face, a chicken wing, or what, a chicken wing, not a chicken wing, a drumstick. Yeah, now this, you're gonna, this is definitely pushing some buttons when you're putting a Cuban official in the picture, kind of dangling food. And this looks like one of the main roads in Havana, going down to Havana Hilton. And now he takes a kind of he's continued work like this. He's still, every day he's making artwork. And you notice he signed his name here. I mean, that's bold. So, he's clearly either, increasing his confidence, or just knows that the situation changed enough where he can, sign his name, or maybe that's just part of him, saying he's not afraid to, to put his name on his work. And here he's, putting these kind of beddings on the street. You can see a few examples here, which I think you can only see as metaphorical kind of comments on the situation in Cuba. There's a lot of ways I think you can interpret this. And it's very similar to the paintings. They're in the street, occupying public space. And I think it goes to show how much he's aware of what he's doing in terms of the metaphor and in terms of public space. And so it makes me very excited to see more of his work, because he is clearly kind of quite aware of his role and his kind of duty to country. And so it's more than just kind of vandalism or street art. It's like he's really using the street as a place to kind of connect to the average Cuban. And here, someone throwing out the trash, communist trash. What a clever use of the cardboard, the texture there to distinguish certain parts of the body. I think that really is really wonderful use of cardboard, and obviously the symbolism here is pretty on the nose. Here, that's not the artist, but his artwork on the shirt. So he's, translating his artwork into clothing, which is, kind of like putting your artwork on the street. Now you're putting your artwork on people's bodies. And so he's not working within the institution. He's working, on the rubble of the institutions. This is the most recent one. This is from 2 days ago, 1 or 2 days ago. And I think, what do you guys think? What do you think do you see this artist as, is he going to get in trouble? You think is he going to leave Cuba? Is he making stuff that, is he going to be able to keep doing this for many years, you think? And the Cuban government won't say anything? I don't know. Do you like his work?
His work's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think it really,
I think
especially to a younger generation, I think it really connects to, I don't know, I just feel like y'all's generation, you're much more kind of cool about animation and kind of graffiti and street art. And I think you all can really relate to the idea of coming up with a character and kind of giving it some vitality by putting it into situations and into the street. And I think you understand now it's so different doing it in Cuba than doing it in the United States. And, I think it's a very powerful kind of symbol of, if someone who's going to consider taking to the streets to protest, if you see this, it might give you feel much more of a feeling like, yeah, I should take to the streets. This is a problem that we all are dealing with. So, maybe the Cuban government will decide, okay, this guy is not helping us preserve the status quo. So something to definitely consider. And if you guys want to write about an artist, you could just add this guy on Facebook and email him and ask him some questions, which is so cool. And he's using, social media to, show his work off. And that's something probably the Cuban government isn't even probably savvy enough to know how to control. And how can you, right? How can you control social media? And like you said, they turn off the social media during the times of protest. So yeah, I guess you can, but it's hard to control someone like this who's spitting out work every day. So, someone definitely to keep your eye on, and hopefully who won't get into trouble, and hopefully who will continue to work in Cuba, and potentially someone who's sowing the seeds of the next kind of social movement in Cuba. And here's another example of an artist, and I think we'll probably just do the first half of class and we'll go right up to, so just give me a few more minutes and we'll get to the end. But this artist is someone who I think is a little more from the institution, someone who's a trained artist by, for the art schools. And I think his artwork benefits from perhaps having officially sanctioned locations, and or maybe even paint, available paint supplies, because this looks more official. This looks like kind of the other side of the coin from Julia Perez that we just saw. And notice, this is what I was talking about earlier, using children as a kind of symbol of hope. And I don't know if this artist, Maisa Lopez, I don't know if he's places are commissioned by the government. Like the government might have said, look, we need someone to make pictures that are, hopeful about the future of the country. Or they might have said, look, we want you to make pictures of children and that, give people a sense of hope. And it's a very interesting strategy, a very clever strategy to use children. Um, Partly, and I mean that both is very negative and a positive way. In the positive sense, uh, I think the children are the ones who are suffering the most in Cuba, as far as maybe uncertainty, and maybe parents want to make sure children have the brightest future, and so maybe they're making sure people are aware that any struggle you have right now in Cuba, you got to keep focused on the real important thing, which is next generation. On the more cynical side. And I don't know if I'm just kind of saying this just to be kind of cynical. You could also say, like, you're using children to guilt people into not challenging the status quo, which is more cynical than I think is what's going on here. And yet, it's hard for me not to kind of look at this and think, well, I was thinking about protesting, but now they're shaming me with children, so I won't. So, and I don't think that's necessarily what's going on, but it's hard for me not to wonder if perhaps the government's like, let's use children and make people, just shame them into feeling a little better, into ignoring the problems that are going on. Now, that's just a cynical interpretation. The more, I think, positive, yeah, children are really important way to remind people of the essential things in life. And you can almost feel the sense that they're using the same scale and space that before was used and exclusively for pictures of Fidel or pictures of Che Guevara. So I do like that now they're kind of acknowledging there's a new generation, and they're the ones who matter, not they're focusing on the future, not on the past. And that butterfly is a very powerful symbol of, transforming and blossoming. So going back to the more kind of generous, less cynical point of view, you could almost see this as like a very revolutionary comment on the disintegration of communism into all these little free butterflies. And this girl one day will grow up, next 10 years, that she might be, a revolutionary or be part of the next generation of Cubans who do whatever they end up doing in Cuba. Now, the most tragic outcome would be for this little girl to leave Cuba and find, well, not tragic for her, but tragic as an indictment of the future of Cuba, because I think we all would like to think that this little girl will have a positive future in Cuba and be able to nourish all of her talents, and that could be the case. And maybe on the worst case scenario, though, she might have to leave because there's diminishing quality of life in Cuba. But I think these are intended to be well, what do you think? Are these intended to be like hopeful pictures about the future of Cuba? Could you see anything cynical? Like for me, there's almost something, like when I know that people aren't, it's hard to travel from Cuba. You're not allowed to get on a boat with a foreigner in Cuba for fear that you're gonna sail away. There's something almost kind of, something, I don't know, there's something weird about a kid looking at a fish, almost a reminder that you can't go into the ocean. And yet, yeah, I think I'm being too cynical, because they are beautiful pictures in public that I think are meant to remind people about the importance of the next generation. What do you guys think? Do you like these pictures? Who do you like more? You like these? Not that liking things is the final measurement of things, but do one of these resonate more with you? The earlier one, Julia Perez, or these? And you can see they're really two different approaches. Julia Perez are more grotesque and gruesome, whereas these are very like everything's good, butterflies, we're happy. Um, Kind of look at the butterfly, don't look at the crumbling decay all around you. Hey, am I being too cynical, or do you guys are these both just kind of great strategies to public use of public space? Am I just asking stupid questions?
I think Junior was uh more to my liking because I like how graphic he is with his art and
Which one? This
how
one or
like
this one or the previous one?
the previous one.
Yeah.
What was his name again? The Junior.
Julia Perez.
Yeah.
Julia Perez.
I think I prefer his art way more, considering that it's more like pulp culture-ish. Like it has its own like little characters and it's really graphic, like something you'll see at a t-shirt shop, really.
Right.
It's really in a way punk.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. That's
I
great.
kind of dig
And
it.
the word
So
punk is great because the punk is like the word idea of punk is you're anti-establishment, right? You're, it doesn't, it's very like kind of to not just sort of go with things the mainstream. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong with it. But yeah, I like the idea, especially because I think Julia Perez's work really resonates more with the younger generation. Ironically, even though this guy's work, Marcel Lopez, is literally the subject matter is the younger generation. I don't think it's this kind of work resonates so much with kind of the teenage, 20 somethings, because of the exposure to the internet and kind of animation and all kinds of other things. So, it's interesting to see these two. I'll just kind of real quickly go through kind of Banksy, this girl letting go of the balloon, very powerful, popular picture by Banksy, another picture of childhood, but very different in the context, of Cuba, a girl looking at a fish versus, girl letting go of a balloon. You kind of have to look at the context to kind of appreciate it. At the same time, there's something timeless about it as well, and a very emotional, minimalistic approach to public space, but very different in Cuba. Here I think is a rare example of a stencil, at least looks like a stencil, it might not be. Um, but that is a little more kind of, perhaps more on the violent side. But of course, violence with a flower sticking out. That seems like a pretty clear reference to Banksy, if not a total, copy of Banksy combining violence and flowers. But I don't think you would expect to see this kind of thing in Cuba because it's too, one, it's just too, I don't think, I think what people are wanting right now in Cuba is food, not to, get thrown in jail or violence. So, Banksy never worries about food. Banksy's kind of using violence as kind of a cartoon, a caricature, but and you could say yes, he's kind of implying overthrow, but it's kind of all from an industrialized country where there's no real threat, there's no real, there's no Molotov cocktail, which is kind of what the figure would be throwing had he not substituted the flowers. But I think this is the kind of thing where this would be too aggressive and or too kind of, this wouldn't kind of help Cubans. What helps them is kind of someone showing empathy, reaching out and saying, I care. We both are struggling for the same thing. This isn't something that says we're both struggling for the same thing. This is, go to the streets or at least ironically, an ironic call to action. But of course, it's sort of neutralizing the violence by substituting with flowers. So you can see how Banksy is very different than what we're seeing today. And that context matters so much. Here's another example of Banksy. So, one reason why you might not see as much stenciling or spray paint in Cuba could be because of the absence of materials like spray cans. But I think the most interesting thing is just that context of Cuba. And that's why so many people are interested in Cuba, of course, too. The idea is it's a country, unique country with a unique political flavor. And the people in Cuba, everyone wonders, what is it like in Cuba? What are people doing in Cuba? Are they contributing something unique to the political spectrum and or artistic spectrum? And there's such an impenetrable veneer of politics that's hard to really know. And so it's very refreshing to see an artist taking work to the street and posting it on social media and not getting thrown in jail for it. A carton of milk is kind of like painting a roll of toilet paper during the pandemic, something that has a lot of resonance to the people, there. Those are like milk carton, like what do you call them, containers that the man is sitting on top of. So just something as simple as that is a reminder of hunger. And so in the United States, we kind of talk about Banksy versus Jeff Koons. Jeff Koons is within the institution, Banksy's outside the institution. And yet in Cuba, it's so different when you think about being outside the institutions, like being outside of the revolution. And I think it's really, you should just kind of follow this artist and see what they do for the next year or two, because eventually it'll all kind of, he'll either, join the protest or the government will kind of, whatever will change, or the United States will change its policy to Cuba or something. I don't know, but I don't necessarily, I think it's again the question of, will those artists who are trained by the revolution, will they continue to flourish as they travel back and forth? Will they ever kind of find common space with these other artists who we're seeing today? Are they kind of oil and vinegar? Are they totally different kind of entities? And, I think whether or not the Cuban government continues to, support artists and the artists don't just leave Cuba permanently will be a really important part of determining whether or not we continue to see really wonderful art from Cuba, and whether or not, hunger reaches a point where, there's just no energy to make art. So hopefully in the next few years, the situation in Cuba will get better. But the sad reality is if it gets a little better, that just might mean postponing, kicking the can down the road. And, who knows what's going to happen, but I would not be surprised if in the next 5 years you hear about people in Santiago, really reaching a point where they just kind of want to, they're clamoring for social change, changing the status quo, ending the embargo. And it will remain to see. I haven't seen pictures of the Cuban government, violently suppressing protests with military. They're doing it in a very clever, clandestine way. And we might not see those kind of images because there isn't necessarily the press or the journalism that needs to document it. But of course, cell phones and smartphones might be the tipping point, just shifting the balance. And it could be that even though they turn off the internet during the protests, you can't, people still have smartphones. So the internet, and I think this has been a question ever since I was in college back in the 90s, is how will the internet influence Cuba? And I think that question really is today, because of social media and people having smartphones. The government really, what can you do? I think totalitarianism has a really hard time controlling people when they have smartphones. Now, China seems to still be doing a good job with that. But of course, China has the social, what's it called? I can't remember what it's called, the social credit. Your phone is like something that records your social credit. And so the phone they kind of use as a tool for preserving the status quo. Whereas in Cuba, I would assume having a smartphone is not, is more of a luxury or an exception rather than the rule. But as a lesson to us in the United States, you could see how the smartphone could very quickly become a tool that's used against you. I mean, just imagine you have children and the government says to your children, you can either have your phone or you can have your parents. Which one do you want? And I think a lot of kids would pick the phone over their parents. And so, be very careful becoming too dependent on technology when they can pull that rug out from underneath you. So, I think this is a wonderful place to end with these artists we've seen today, and a really promising, use of art for the future, and of course also a really bittersweet place to end because of Cuba's current situation. And just remember, next week we will have office hours, so I'll make that time available for you guys to talk to me about your paper. And the final paper or the final exam will just be more of an evaluation of the class. And let me know if you need some help focusing your paper or writing about an artist or anything at all. And so I'll probably be in touch with you before the next class, but I probably won't see you again. And so it's been a really or I might see some of you. Of course, I could see all of you again, depending on what your future brings. And it's been really a wonderful class. It's been a real honor to tackle this subject matter. Very, humbling experience, talk about Cuba. And I think also a really important thing for you guys, because one day I think you'll really appreciate this class in a different way because of the changes that you'll see in Cuba. And who knows, maybe you'll go to Cuba and meet some of these artists and get to see a lot of this stuff at ground level. And I do certainly think we've gotten a great view of a lot the really interesting history of Cuba, which continues. And like I said earlier, it's very rare to look at art history that's alive. Mexico with Mexican muralism, it sort of had its heyday in the 1920s and 30s, and certainly could always bounce back. But in Cuba, it's almost like all the history is leading up to this present day and what happens. So I certainly hope you put Cuba on your horizon as a place to visit. Just always be careful where you travel, and travel with other people, and do your research before you go. So unless there's any other questions, I will dismiss class, and let me know if you need to see any lectures or anything at all from me. So I won't see you next week, but I will be in touch with you before then. And yeah, stay safe and good luck finishing your semester. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you, Sammy. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you, Jay. Thanks. Yes, me too. I will let you know how Squeaks is doing, but she seems to be reacting well to the love that you guys are sharing with her. So yes, Squeaks, I think will be back climbing through trees in a few weeks. Bye, Daniela. Bye, Amy. Bye, Laura.